At 11,000 feet over Germany, the B-17 Flying Fortress was dying. 2 engines burned. The cockpit windscreen was shattered. The co-pilot slumped forward, bleeding from wounds that should have been fatal. The pilot's right hand gripped a control column slick with hydraulic fluid and blood, his own. 20 degrees of bank. Airspeed falling through 160. 8 men still breathing in the fuselage behind him. The mathematics of survival had already failed. The morning of February 20th, 1944, began with frost on the hardstands at Ruckham, England. Station 468, home of the 305th Bombardment Group, 8th Air Force. The pre-dawn temperature hovered near 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to stiffen fingers and slow the loading crews wrestling 500-pound general-purpose bombs into the bellies of waiting fortresses. First Lieutenant William R. Lawley Jr. walked across the frozen grass toward his aircraft in the gray half-light before sunrise. He was 23 years old, slim, dark-haired, from Leeds, Alabama, a town so small it barely registered on state maps. He had the quiet manner of a man who measured words the way a navigator measured headings, sparingly, precisely, and only when necessary. His assigned aircraft that morning was a B-17G, one of the latest production models featuring the chin turret that earlier fortresses had lacked. The improvement mattered. Head-on attacks from German fighters had torn through previous formations with devastating efficiency, exploiting the blind spot beneath the nose. The chin turret changed the calculus, but not entirely. The Luftwaffe adapted. They always adapted. The target was Leipzig, deep in eastern Germany. Aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, the industrial organs that kept the German war machine breathing. Leipzig meant a round trip of over 1,200 miles. It meant 6 hours of flight time minimum, assuming everything went according to plan. It meant crossing the Rhine, penetrating past Hanover, and pushing deeper into defended airspace than most crews had ever flown. The 8th Air Force called it Big Week. For 7 consecutive days, beginning February 20th, American heavy bombers would hammer German aircraft production with unprecedented mass. The strategic logic was brutal but coherent. Destroy the factories building Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, and the Luftwaffe would eventually run out of fighters to defend the Reich. The cost would be measured in bombers and crews. Lawley climbed through the forward hatch of his fortress and settled into the left seat. The cockpit of a B-17G was a cramped cathedral of instruments, switches, and controls. Directly ahead, the main panel presented over 100 gauges and indicators. Engine instruments dominated the center. Manifold pressure, cylinder head temperature, oil pressure, fuel quantity for each of the 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines. To his right sat Second Lieutenant Paul Murphy, the co-pilot. Murphy was newer to the crew, still learning the particular rhythms of Lawley's command style. In the B-17, the pilot and co-pilot functioned as a single organism during emergencies. The left-seater flew. The right-seater managed engines, monitored systems, handled emergency procedures. If one was incapacitated, the other had to do everything. Behind and below them, the bombardier and navigator occupied the nose compartment. The bombardier would take control of the aircraft during the final bomb run through the Norden bomb site, a device so secret that crews were ordered to destroy it rather than allow capture. The navigator tracked position through dead reckoning, celestial fixes when weather permitted, and radio aids when available. In the waist, 2 gunners manned flexible 50-caliber machine guns at open windows. The ball turret gunner folded himself into the cramped sphere beneath the fuselage, rotating to track threats from below. The tail gunner sat alone at the extreme rear, watching for fighters attacking from 6 o'clock. The radio operator doubled as an additional gunner when necessary. 10 men, 1 aircraft, 12 hours of survival required. The engines coughed to life in sequence. Number 3 first, the standard starting order. Then number 4, then 1 and 2. The sound built from isolated mechanical clattering to a sustained roar that vibrated through the airframe and into the bones of everyone aboard. By 0730 hours, the 305th Bombardment Group was airborne and climbing. Formation assembly over England was an exercise in controlled chaos. Hundreds of bombers from multiple groups spiraled upward through cloud layers, each aircraft searching for its assigned position within the combat box. The process consumed time and fuel, two commodities that would matter desperately later. The combat box formation was the 8th Air Force's answer to German fighter tactics. By clustering bombers together, each aircraft's defensive guns could support its neighbors. The overlapping fields of fire created a theoretical zone of mutual protection. In practice, the formation worked only when it stayed intact. Stragglers were prey. Lawley's aircraft found its position within the 305th's formation as the group crossed the English coast near Great Yarmouth. Altitude was 23,000 feet, still climbing toward the planned bombing altitude of 26,000. Temperature at altitude was approximately -30 degrees Fahrenheit. At that cold, exposed skin froze in minutes. Oxygen masks became crusted with ice from exhaled moisture. Gun mechanisms thickened and jammed. Human error multiplied as hypoxia crept into the edges of consciousness. The waist gunners stood at open windows, the wind cutting through their heated suits with brutal efficiency. The ball turret gunner rotated slowly in his glass and steel sphere, scanning the sky below for the first sign of fighters. The formation droned eastward across the North Sea. What waited over Germany was the largest concentration of air defense fighters in history. The Reichsluftverteidigung, the Reich Air Defense, had evolved into a sophisticated system of early warning radar, ground-controlled interception, and massed fighter response. German controllers tracked incoming bomber streams from the moment they crossed the Dutch coast, vectoring fighters to intercept at optimal positions. The American formations would face Bf-109s and FW-190s in numbers ranging from dozens to hundreds, depending on the target and the weather. The fighters would attack in waves, pressing through the defensive fire, breaking apart formations, and isolating damaged bombers for destruction. Escort fighters could help, but range limitations meant the bombers flew alone for significant portions of the mission. The P-47 Thunderbolts had the legs to reach partway into Germany. The P-51 Mustangs, newly arriving in theater, could go farther. But even with escorts, the bombers bore the weight of their own defense. Lawley had flown this gauntlet before. He understood that survival was not about individual skill, but collective discipline. Holding formation position, maintaining altitude, not flinching when the fighters came. The channel crossing completed, the formation began the overland transit. Below, the brown and gray patchwork of occupied Europe slid past, the Netherlands, then Germany proper. Flak batteries announced the bomber's passage with black puffs of smoke that appeared suddenly, silently, then burst with delayed concussions that rocked the aircraft. The first fighter attacks came near the German border. Specks appeared at the edge of visibility, coalescing into recognizable shapes as they closed, single-engine fighters climbing toward the formation from below and ahead. The standard Luftwaffe approach, build speed in a dive, converted into a climbing attack, slash through the formation, and escape before the defensive fire could concentrate. The gunners aboard Lawley's Fortress opened fire as the first wave came into range. The sound inside the aircraft changed from engine drone to violent hammering as the .50 calibers began cycling rounds. Brass casings cascaded across the deck plates. Smoke and cordite filled the fuselage. The fighters flashed past in seconds, too fast to track, too brief to aim accurately. Shooting at a fighter crossing at 400 miles per hour, combined closure speed was an exercise in probability, not precision. You filled the air with bullets and hoped physics favored your geometry. The first wave passed without visible damage to Lawley's aircraft, but the mission was barely half complete. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. William Lawley had been flying since before the war made pilots a strategic commodity. He enlisted in the Army Air Corps in December 1942, 1 year after Pearl Harbor transformed American indifference into national mobilization. His path to the cockpit was unremarkable in the aggregate. Thousands of young men from small towns followed similar trajectories, but the details mattered. He completed primary flight training in the open cockpit Stearman biplane, learning to feel the aircraft through the seat of his pants before the instruments made sense. The Stearman taught reflexes. It punished hesitation. Students who survived learned to trust their hands and feet before their eyes. Basic training followed in the BT-13 Valiant, a heavier aircraft with a closed canopy and more complex systems. Then advanced training, transition to multi-engine aircraft, and finally, assignment to heavy bombers. The B-17 was nothing like the trainers. The Fortress demanded crew coordination in ways that single-pilot aircraft could not approximate. The pilot was not a solo performer, but a conductor managing 10 specialists, each essential to the whole. The aircraft commander had to understand navigation, bombardment, gunnery, communication, and engineering sufficiently to make decisions when those specialists were wounded, frozen, or dead. Lawley demonstrated competence without flash. His instructors noted methodical procedures and conservative decision-making. He followed checklists completely. He called out altitude and airspeed changes to his co-pilot, even when the other pilot could see the instruments himself. He briefed his crew before every mission with the same level of detail, regardless of whether the target was familiar or new. These were not the qualities that produced aces or generated publicity photographs. They were the qualities that kept 10 men alive through statistical improbability. By February 1944, Lawley had accumulated experience across multiple missions over occupied Europe. Each mission added knowledge that couldn't be taught in training: the specific feel of flak bursting close enough to smell, the visual signature of fighters setting up for a frontal attack, the sound of machine gun rounds striking the aluminum skin of the aircraft. He understood that the B-17 was simultaneously durable and fragile. Durable because the airframe could absorb extraordinary punishment and continue flying. Fortresses had returned to England with entire tail sections shot away, with dozens of holes through the wings, with engines burning and control surfaces missing. The aircraft's redundant systems, 4 engines when 2 could maintain flight, dual control cables, multiple fuel tanks, provided margins that saved crews who would have died in less robust machines. Fragile because the men inside were soft flesh in a metal shell. A single bullet in the right place killed instantly. Cold killed slowly, but just as certainly. Fire killed terribly. The aircraft might survive what its crew could not. Lawley had seen both outcomes. He had watched other fortresses fall from formation, trailing smoke, spinning, disintegrating. He had seen parachutes blossom from stricken aircraft and had seen no parachutes at all. He had landed back in England with wounded crewmen and had taxied past hardstands where aircraft that left that morning would never return. The experience did not make him fatalistic. It made him precise. His pre-flight procedures became rituals of survival. He personally inspected control surfaces before every mission. He verified fuel loads against planned consumption, He reviewed emergency procedures with his crew until the responses became automatic. The co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Murphy, was newer to the war. Murphy had completed the same training pipeline but lacked the accumulated hours of combat exposure. He was competent, eager, still learning the gap between peacetime proficiency and wartime necessity. Lawley worked to close that gap through repetition and example rather than lecture. The other 8 crewmen represented the same mix of experience and inexperience that characterized most 8th Air Force aircraft by early 1944. The gunners knew their weapons. The navigator had developed instincts for dead reckoning when clouds obscured the ground. The bombardier had practiced the bomb run procedures until he could execute them under fire. Together, they formed a functioning unit aboard an aircraft designed for precisely one purpose: delivering bombs to targets despite enemy opposition. The Leipzig mission would test whether that design and that unit could survive its margins being exceeded. The standard B-17 crew procedure for surviving fighter attacks was deceptively simple: hold position, maintain altitude, and trust the formation. Individual evasion was worse than useless. A pilot who broke formation to dodge one fighter exposed himself to every other fighter waiting for stragglers. The combat box worked only through discipline, the collective sacrifice of individual survival instinct for mutual protection. Lawley had internalized this logic across previous missions. He had held position when every nerve demanded that he dive for the clouds. He had maintained altitude when aircraft ahead of him exploded and scattered debris through the formation. He had trusted the gunners behind him to handle threats he couldn't see, while he focused on flying precise formation. Previous missions had taught him the specific rhythms of German fighter tactics. The first wave probed for weak points. The second wave exploited them. The third wave finished the work. Controllers on the ground-vectored fresh fighters to intercept, while the first attackers returned to base for fuel and ammunition. The assault continued in relays, maintaining pressure across hundreds of miles. The American response was endurance. Bombers that survived the initial attacks usually survived the mission. The fighter coverage improved as the stream penetrated deeper, with relay escort fighters picking up where earlier coverage ended. The key was getting through the initial penetration phase without losing formation integrity. Lawley's crew had managed this successfully on previous missions. They had taken damage. Every veteran crew accumulated patches and field repairs, but they had brought their aircraft home each time. The statistics favored them. Survival rates improved with experience, as crews learned what training couldn't teach. But statistics were averages. Individual missions were not. The February 20th mission to Leipzig represented a concentration of risk that exceeded normal parameters. The target was deeper than usual. The expected opposition was heavier than usual. The weather promised to complicate both navigation and fighter interception. The briefing officers had acknowledged the difficulty without embellishment. They had outlined the expected fighter opposition. Over 200 German aircraft were estimated to be available for defense. They had reviewed the escort coverage, P-47s to the German border, then a gap, then P-51s picking up coverage near the target. They had discussed abort criteria, rally points, and emergency procedures. None of it prepared crews for what waiting felt like. The cruise to target was an exercise in psychological management. Hours of engine noise and cold and fear, with nothing to do but scan the sky and wait. Gunners rotated turrets in slow arcs, searching for the specks that would resolve into enemy aircraft. Pilots monitored instruments and formation position. Everyone wondered when the next attack would come. Lawley maintained his formation position with the unconscious precision of accumulated habit. He flew approximately 15 feet off the right wing of the aircraft ahead, matching every altitude change and turn with adjustments so smooth that observers would have assumed autopilot control. But the B-17 had no autopilot sophisticated enough for formation work. Every correction was manual, the product of constant attention and immediate response. The aircraft burned fuel at approximately 180 gallons per hour at cruise power, all 4 engines combined. The mission profile called for approximately 8 hours of flight time, with margins for weather, combat maneuvering, and the inevitable inefficiencies of formation flying. The margins were thin. Combat operations consumed extra fuel that planning assumptions often failed to capture. Evasive maneuvering burned more than straight and level cruise. Climbs burned more than descents. The actual fuel state at any given moment was an estimate, not a certainty. Lawley monitored the fuel gauges with the same attention he gave to formation position. The first hours passed without major incident. Scattered flak tracked the formation across occupied territory. Fighter contacts came and went, probing attacks that failed to break the combat box. The formation held. Leipzig appeared on the navigation charts as the formation commander began the approach procedures for the bomb run. The bomb run was the most dangerous phase of the mission. For the final minutes before bomb release, the formation flew straight and level at constant altitude and airspeed, predictable, vulnerable, unable to evade. The bombardiers needed stable platforms for accurate aim. The flak gunners on the ground knew exactly where the bombers would be and when. The aircraft shuddered as flak bursts walked through the formation. Black puffs appeared ahead, beside, above, the shells exploding with delayed fuses set to the estimated altitude of the bomber. Stream. Each puff was shrapnel, hundreds of metal fragments scything through the air at velocities sufficient to penetrate aluminum skin and human flesh alike. Lawley's fortress took hits, but remained airborne. The bombardier called bombs away. The aircraft lurched upward as thousands of pounds of ordnance fell free, the sudden weight reduction changing the flight characteristics until the pilot compensated. The formation began its turn for home, and that was when the German fighters returned in force. The attack developed from 12 o'clock high. The geometry was classic. Fighters diving through the formation on a frontal intercept, converting altitude into speed, presenting minimal target profiles to the defensive gunners, and closing at combined velocities exceeding 500 miles per hour. At that closure rate, a gunner had approximately 4 seconds of effective engagement time before the fighter flashed past. 4 seconds to acquire, track, aim, and fire. The mathematical odds favored the attacker. The first pass struck Lawley's fortress with catastrophic effect. Cannon rounds, 20mm explosive shells rather than rifle-caliber bullets, tore through the forward fuselage. The windscreen shattered. Cold air blasted into the cockpit at 250 miles per hour. The co-pilot, Lieutenant Murphy, slumped forward in his harness, struck by fragments that penetrated his flight suit and body. Simultaneously, rounds impacted the No. 3 engine, the inboard, right, penetrating the cowling and igniting fuel within the nacelle. Fire erupted, visible through the shattered windscreen, orange flames streaming backward in the slipstream. The No. 1 engine, outboard left, was also hit. Oil pressure dropped immediately. The propeller began windmilling as the internal mechanisms seized. In less than 5 seconds, the aircraft lost half its power plant. The immediate flight dynamics were brutal. The asymmetric thrust from the 2 functioning engines on the right wing against the dead and burning engines on the left created a yawing moment that pushed the nose left and the aircraft into a descending spiral. Lawley's hands and feet responded before conscious thought organized the situation. He applied right rudder to counter the yaw, pressing the pedal against the firewall to generate maximum opposing force. He added right aileron to level the wings against the rolling tendency. He pushed the control column forward to lower the nose and maintain airspeed, trading altitude for the energy needed to stay flying. The aircraft responded, partially. The control inputs arrested the spiral, but could not restore normal flight. The burning engine continued trailing fire. The dead engine dragged the left wing down. The two functioning engines labored at maximum continuous power, straining against the asymmetric load. Altitude was falling. The aircraft had begun the engagement at approximately 26,000 feet. Within seconds of the attack, it was descending through 24,000 feet, then 22,000. The rate of descent was approximately 1,000 feet per minute. Survivable for now, but mathematically certain to impact terrain eventually. Lawley assessed the situation with the trained reflexes of accumulated emergency procedure practice. Two engines inoperative. Fire on number 3, control surfaces responding, but compromised. Co-pilot unconscious or dead. Unknown damage to systems throughout the aircraft. Crew status unknown. The emergency procedure for engine fire in a B-17 was clear. Feather the propeller to stop rotation, cut fuel to the affected engine, activate the fire extinguisher, and hope the flames died before structural failure occurred. Lawley reached for the feathering controls. The number 3 propeller refused to feather. The mechanism was damaged, whether by the same cannon fire that ignited the engine or by subsequent heating from the fire itself. There was no time to determine. The propeller continued rotating in the slipstream, fanning the flames, generating drag that worsened the asymmetric handling. The fire extinguisher discharged into the nacelle. The flames flickered but did not die. The extinguisher's capacity was designed for initial suppression, not sustained firefighting. If the fire wasn't out in the first seconds, it likely wasn't going out at all. The aircraft had become a flying crematorium. Fire in a B-17 was the crew's deepest fear. The aircraft carried over 2,000 gallons of aviation gasoline distributed across multiple wing tanks. If the fire spread from the engine nacelle into the wing structure, the fuel would ignite. The subsequent explosion would be instantaneous and total. Standard doctrine for uncontrollable engine fire was unambiguous: abandon aircraft. The aircraft commander had authority to order bailout. The crew had practiced the procedure, each man assigned a specific exit, a specific sequence, a specific priority. The bailout alarm would sound. The crew would move to positions. They would jump in order, chutes opening, falling toward capture or concealment depending on luck and location. Lawley knew the doctrine. He also knew the co-pilot was wounded and unconscious. Murphy couldn't bail out. He couldn't unfasten his harness, move to an exit, or pull his ripcord. If the crew abandoned the aircraft, Murphy would burn with it. The decision point crystallized in seconds. Lawley could order bailout, save 8 crewmen including himself, and accept Murphy's death as the unavoidable cost of proper emergency procedure. No one would question the decision. The doctrine was clear. The situation was textbook, or he could refuse to bail out. He could continue flying a burning aircraft with 2 engines, damaged controls, and falling altitude. He could attempt to reach friendly territory, or at least territory where a crash landing wouldn't guarantee capture. He could gamble 10 lives on his ability to keep a dying aircraft airborne. The mathematics were not favorable. Distance to the English coast, approximately 400 miles. Altitude available, perhaps 20,000 feet and falling. Time before the fire reached the fuel tanks, unknown but measured in minutes rather than hours. Fuel remaining, marginal for the original mission profile, now critical with 2 engines dead. Every calculation pointed to the same conclusion. Bail out, accept the loss, save who you can save. Lawley did not order bailout. The decision was physical before it was moral. Lawley tightened his grip on the control column and held the aircraft against the forces trying to tear it apart. The rudder pressure required maximum leg strength, sustained continuously. The aileron pressure demanded constant arm tension. The coordination between hands and feet had to remain precise, even as cold air blasted through the shattered windscreen at temperatures far below zero. He was bleeding. The same cannon fire that wounded Murphy had struck Lawley, fragments penetrating his left hand, his arm, and his face. The wounds were not immediately fatal, but they were not trivial. Blood streamed across his flight suit and made the control column slick beneath his fingers. The aircraft continued burning. The No. 3 engine fire had not spread to the wing tanks yet, but the flames continued streaming from the nacelle, visible to any observer in the formation, and certainly visible to the German fighters still circling the area. A burning bomber was a marked target. Fighters would return to finish the kill. Altitude passed through 18,000 feet. Lawley assessed his options with the clarity that extreme circumstances sometimes impose. He could not climb. The available power from 2 engines was insufficient to overcome drag and maintain altitude simultaneously. He could only trade altitude for distance, descending gradually while covering ground toward the west. The navigation problem was severe. The original course to Leipzig and back had been planned for a formation following prescribed routes at prescribed speeds. Lawley was now alone, off course, at a different altitude, with no external references for position. The navigator would have to establish location through dead reckoning, estimating position based on last known location, heading, and time elapsed. The crew began checking in. Voice communications within the aircraft used the intercom system, allowing Lawley to assess status without leaving his position. The reports came fragmentarily, each man accounting for himself and his immediate area. The tail gunner was wounded, but functional. The ball turret gunner reported his position intact. The waist gunners had taken shrapnel hits, but remained at stations. The radio operator was attempting to establish contact with any available station. The navigator was working the position problem. Murphy remained unconscious. The co-pilot's wounds were bleeding visibly. His oxygen mask had been displaced, meaning he was breathing the thin air of altitude without supplemental oxygen. At 18,000 feet, time of useful consciousness without oxygen was approximately 30 minutes. After that, brain damage began. Death followed. Lawley could not reach Murphy's oxygen system from his own position without releasing the controls. The aircraft would spiral within seconds of control release. The physical geometry of the situation was a trap. Lawley was pinned in his seat by the constant control inputs required to keep the aircraft flying. He could not help Murphy directly. He could not move. He could only fly. Another crewman moved forward. The top turret gunner, Technical Sergeant Henry Mason, left his position and entered the cockpit. He saw Murphy's condition. He reconnected the oxygen mask. He applied first aid to the worst of the visible wounds. He did what Lawley could not do. The intervention bought time for Murphy, but did not solve the fundamental problem. The aircraft was still descending, still burning, still hundreds of miles from safety. Altitude passed through 15,000 feet. The lower altitude brought warmer air, relatively speaking, and denser atmosphere. The engines could draw more oxygen, improving power output marginally. But the lower altitude also brought the aircraft closer to the effective range of light flak batteries. Below 10,000 feet, small-caliber anti-aircraft guns could engage. Below 5,000 feet, even, rifle fire could be dangerous. Lawley had to balance altitude against distance. Higher altitude meant more safety from ground fire but faster fuel consumption and more difficulty maintaining flight with damaged engines. Lower altitude meant greater fuel efficiency and easier flight control, but increased vulnerability to ground defenses. He chose a compromise, descending gradually rather than diving, trading altitude for westward progress at a rate that might reach friendly territory before the fuel ran out. The fighters came back. They had seen the burning engine. They had seen the aircraft dropping from formation. They knew what a straggler meant. The attack came from the rear quarter, the standard finishing angle against crippled bombers. The tail gunner opened fire, his .50 caliber tracers reaching toward the incoming fighters. The ball turret rotated to engage. The waist gunners added their fire as the fighters passed through their fields of view. The B-17's defensive armament was its final protection. 13 .50 caliber machine guns distributed across the aircraft created overlapping fields of fire that made approach hazardous for attacking fighters. The individual probability of hitting a fast-moving target was low, but the aggregate effect was suppressive. Fighters had to fly through the fire to press their attacks. This attack pressed through. Additional rounds struck the aircraft. The damage accumulated. More holes in the fuselage, more systems compromised, more crew wounded. The ball turret reported hydraulic failure, the mechanism no longer able to rotate under power. The turret gunner had to crank the turret manually to the position that would allow him to exit. The attack passed. The fighters broke off, whether from damage, ammunition exhaustion, or assignment to other targets. Lawley couldn't know. The immediate threat receded. The long-term threat remained. Altitude passed through 12,000 feet. The English coast was still over 300 miles distant. The crew's survival depended on geography and fuel. Lawley flew the aircraft westward with the mechanical persistence of a man who had reduced his world to a single task. Hold the heading, manage the power, monitor the fuel. Everything else was irrelevant. The burning engine eventually exhausted its fuel supply. The flames died when there was nothing left to burn. The nacelle remained blackened and damaged, but the immediate fire threat ended. The structural integrity of the wing remained. The fire had not reached the main tanks. The aircraft was still flyable. 2 engines, 12,000 feet, 250 miles to the coast. The mathematics had improved marginally. 2 engines at lower altitude could maintain level flight if the pilot managed power and speed precisely. The fuel consumption would be lower than at combat altitude. The odds shifted from impossible to merely improbable. But new problems emerged to replace the old. The hydraulic system was failing. The B-17 used hydraulics for landing gear, brakes, and flap extension. Without hydraulic pressure, the landing gear would have to be lowered manually, a time-consuming cranking procedure that required crew members working in coordination. The brakes would be degraded or absent. The flaps might not extend at all. Landing a B-17 without brakes or flaps was possible, but dramatically more difficult. The approach speed would be higher. The landing roll would be longer. The aircraft would need a long, unobstructed runway, not always available at English bases. Lawley added this to his mental list of problems to solve later. The immediate priority remained: reach England. The formation had long since disappeared. The other aircraft of the 305th Bombardment Group had continued their egress, unable to slow down to match the crippled fortress's speed without endangering themselves. Lawley was alone over Germany, then alone over occupied Holland, then alone over the North Sea. The escort fighters found him. Somewhere over the Dutch coast, P-47 Thunderbolts appeared. American aircraft returning from their own escort missions with fuel to spare. They spotted the lone fortress trailing smoke and formed a protective screen around it. The escort could not repair the damage, they could not add fuel, they could not fly the aircraft for Lawley, but they could intercept any German fighters that might pursue a cripple toward the coast. They could provide the margin of safety that allowed Lawley to focus entirely on flying. The English coast appeared. It was simply a line of darker color on the horizon, resolving gradually into cliffs and beaches and the patchwork of fields beyond. The sight carried no emotional weight in the moment. There was too much still to do. But the crew members who could see it understood what it meant. They had reached friendly territory. The question now was whether they could land. The hydraulic system pressure had dropped to 0. The landing gear indicator showed all 3 gear in the up position. The crew began the manual extension procedure, working the hand cranks that would force the gear down through mechanical linkage alone. The procedure was slow and exhausting at altitude, where oxygen-depleted air made physical exertion dangerous. But the gear came down, first the main gear, then the nose wheel. The indicators shifted to showdown and locked. The flaps remained problematic. Without hydraulic pressure, flap extension required an emergency procedure using compressed air bottles. The bottles had limited capacity, enough for one extension cycle. If the flaps failed to extend, or extended unevenly, the landing would be significantly more challenging. Lawley committed to the approach. He found the nearest suitable field, a bomber command base with a long enough runway to accommodate a B-17 without brakes. He coordinated with the tower by radio, communicating the emergency through the damaged intercom system that relayed to the radio operator. The approach began. Speed was high because the flaps extended only partially. The asymmetric thrust from the 2 operating engines required constant correction. The control column was still slick with blood, both Murphy's and Lawley's own. The shattered windscreen admitted a continuous blast of air that made instrument reading difficult and hearing impossible. The runway threshold passed beneath. The aircraft touched down, hard, but within survivable limits. The main gear absorbed the impact, the nose gear held. The aircraft was on the ground. Without effective brakes, the deceleration was agonizingly slow. Lawley used differential throttle and rudder to keep the aircraft tracking down the runway centerline. The end of the runway approached. The aircraft was still moving at 50 miles per hour, then 40, then 30. It stopped with runway remaining. The engines wound down. The propellers stuttered and fell still. For the first time in hours, the constant roar that had filled the cockpit ceased. Rescue crews converged on the aircraft. Medical personnel extracted the wounded. Murphy first, then the other crew members with injuries requiring immediate attention. Lawley remained in his seat until hands guided him out, his own wounds now demanding the treatment he had refused to prioritize. The crew had survived. Every man who boarded that aircraft that morning in England walked or was carried away from it that afternoon. None died in the air, none died in the landing, none was captured or lost. The aircraft itself was a monument to destruction. Maintenance crews later counted over 300 holes in the fuselage and wings. Control cables were severed in multiple places, with remaining strands bearing loads they were never designed to carry alone. The No. 3 engine was burned beyond recognition. The No. 1 engine was frozen from oil starvation. Structurally, the aircraft should not have remained intact. Aerodynamically, the aircraft should not have remained flyable. Statistically, the crew should not have survived. But statistics describe populations, not individuals. Lawley had refused the statistical outcome and imposed a different one through physical effort sustained across hours of pain, cold, and diminishing options. The Medal of Honor citation for First Lieutenant William R. Lawley Jr. was approved on August 4, 1944. The language was formal, precise, and deliberately understated in the manner of official military documents. It described the events of February 20th in declarative sentences that conveyed fact without emotion. The citation noted that Lawley had displayed conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. It mentioned the crippled aircraft, the wounded co-pilot, the decision not to bail out, and the successful return to base. It did not describe the specific physical sensation of holding the control column for 3 hours with a wounded hand. It did not mention the cold that penetrated through the shattered windscreen at temperatures sufficient to cause frostbite in minutes. It did not quantify the blood loss that left Lawley barely conscious by the time the aircraft touched down. The gap between official language and lived experience was vast and unbridgeable. Citations existed to communicate institutional recognition. They were not designed to capture the texture of fear, the weight of uncertainty, or the physical cost of sustained effort under conditions that exceeded human design specifications. Lawley received the medal from President Roosevelt at a White House ceremony. The photograph from that day shows a young man in dress uniform, slim and composed, accepting recognition for an event that photography could not depict. The image conveyed honor, ceremony, and national gratitude. It could not convey what it felt like to know that 9 other men were breathing because of a decision made in seconds and sustained across hours. The other crewmen received recognition as well. Technical Sergeant Henry Mason, who had left his turret position to aid the wounded co-pilot, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The other crew members received Air Medals and Purple Hearts according to their injuries and actions. Lieutenant Murphy survived. The wounds that should have killed him proved survivable with immediate medical attention and subsequent treatment. He returned to duty eventually, another young man carrying invisible damage through the remainder of a war that had no patience for recovery. Lawley flew again. The administrative machinery of the 8th Air Force processed wounded pilots back into operational status according to medical clearance and operational necessity. Lawley completed additional missions before the administrative decision to reassign him to non-combat duties recognized that some experiences exceeded repetition. After the war, Lawley returned to Alabama. He married, he raised children. He lived the unremarkable life of a man who had experienced something that defied explanation and chose not to explain it. The Medal of Honor entitled him to certain privileges and recognitions, but he rarely sought them. He died in 1999, having lived into an era when the B-17 existed only in museums and memories. His name appears on the official rolls of Medal of Honor recipients, one entry among hundreds from the Second World War. The entry provides basic facts: name, rank, date, location, general description of action. It does not provide the specific knowledge of what it feels like to hold a dying aircraft in the air through will and bleeding hands when every sensible calculation demands you let it fall. The crews of the 8th Air Force lost over 26,000 men killed in action during the war. Another 8,000 were wounded. Another 18,000 became prisoners of war. The statistical probability of surviving a complete tour of 25 missions, later raised to 30, then 35 as the air war intensified, was calculated at various points to be less than 30%. The men who flew understood these numbers. They flew anyway, not because they ignored the mathematics, but because the mathematics applied to groups, not to individuals, and each man carried some private calculus of survival that allowed him to climb into the aircraft one more time. Lawley's calculus on February 20th, 1944, produced a different equation than doctrine prescribed. Doctrine said, bail out. Doctrine said, accept the loss. Doctrine said, save who you can save, and let physics claim the rest. Lawley's equation included a variable that doctrine did not account for: the specific weight of one unconscious man in the right seat whose survival depended entirely on whether the left-seater chose to fly or chose to fall. He chose to fly. The choice was not heroic in the sense of conscious selflessness or performed valor. It was immediate, physical, and sustained through hours of degrading conditions that would have justified abandonment at any point. The aircraft that landed at that English base that afternoon was not the same aircraft that had taken off that morning. It was held together by structural margins that should have failed and control inputs that should have been impossible. It flew because one man refused to accept that it could not fly, and transmitted that refusal through his hands and feet into the machine until the machine believed it too. There is no technical explanation for that transmission. Flight manuals do not account for the phenomenon of an aircraft flying beyond its design limits because its pilot would not permit otherwise. But the men who maintained and flew the B-17 Flying Fortress knew that such phenomena occurred. They occurred in the space between what engineering predicted and what combat demanded, the space where human will intersected with mechanical capability and sometimes, inexplicably, prevailed. The German defenders who tracked Lawley's aircraft across the Reich that day observed a cripple that should have fallen. It did not fall. It burned and bled and descended through the altitudes that should have marked its death. And it continued flying west until it reached friendly territory and landed, and yielded up its crew alive. The machinery of air defense had no category for such outcomes. Neither, ultimately, did the official language of military citation, but the 10 men who walked away from that aircraft knew what category applied. It was the category of one pilot who refused to let go of the controls when letting go was the only sensible thing to do. William Lawley held on. That is the complete statement of what happened over Germany on February 20th, 1944. No additional explanation improves upon it.